Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Pia Campeggiani, and she is the Associate Professor of Moral Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Communication Studies of the University of Bologna, and so we're talking today about her book, Theories of Emotion. Dr. Campeggiani, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really happy and honored to be here.
So tell us a little bit, why this book?
Well, it all started with very pragmatical reasons, as it is often the case in my life. I had just got my job in Bologna. It was the first permanent position I had, and I was assigned new teaching, of course. So I wanted to teach philosophy of emotion to my students. It's a subject that it's been booming over the last decades, but not so much in Italy. Of course, there are people who do it in Italy as well, but there were, to my knowledge at least, there were no teaching with this name, and there were no handbooks that would introduce students to the discipline, if you can call it a discipline, but that's something we can talk about later on.
Yes.
So I decided to build my teaching, and it was the first lockdown had just started. So I really had plenty of time, and I started writing down my notes to prepare my classes. And well, it ended up in the book, more or less as it is now. Actually, I tried it on my students, and then I decided it had worked well enough. So I edited it a little bit, and then it was published in Italian first, and in English afterwards. That's the edition I assume you have in your hands.
Yes, yeah, that's and I have the electronic copy, so I'm not able to show it, but I really I enjoy the cover, and I'm really excited to talk about this today.
Lovely, isn't it?
Yes.
It's
So, and I love
from,
the.
No, I was saying the picture. That's the favorite part of the book. My favorite part of the book is the picture on the cover. I chose it from one of my favorite movies, the 400 Blows by Truffaut.
Yes. I knew it was familiar.
I've
seen this. Yeah. So I love how you structured it, and as you're talking about it coming from a class, it kind of makes sense. With you have did you have debates with your students? So you have your different theories of emotion that you talk about, and then you have the debates following each theory, and so it's divided into these three sets of theories and three debates. Is that kind of the structure of the class? Is that why you did it that way?
Well, not really. I thought it would be useful for the class as well, but it was a matter of principle. So I wanted to use the theoretical part in order to test real problems. So I wanted to make it visible for the students that this stuff we talk about, even if sometimes it can sound very abstract. I mean, it does never sound very abstract if you talk of emotions, of course, but the language might sound so sometimes. And so I wanted them to see that taking different positions or different approaches on the theoretical side might determine very different ways of looking at solutions in more practical problems or in experiences that we all have and we can talk about more easily. So that's why I decided to put the theories into test in specific fields.
Yes, and I think that takes us to a really interesting one of the things I love about it is you start off by mentioning that this is a philosophical introduction to a very interdisciplinary field. What is the value? Why does this need to be interdisciplinary?
Well, I think more or less anything. If you want to understand any kind of problem, the more perspectives you take on it, the better you're going to understand it, especially if it's about the way human beings or non-human animals as well function and live and have subjective experiences. So we are at a point where, I mean, we could sit down in a chair and think really hard and end up with a very good system that looks beautiful, but we want it to be able to explain what happens in a way that is understandable by everybody, and we want it to be able to allow us to make predictions that make sense. And so we can't disregard, for example, what we know from the so-called hard sciences. Biology, in this case, for example, plays a dominant role, and we have to try to design our own explanation in a way that takes into account all that we know in different fields as well. So that was the idea, and I think it's a good idea not only when you work on emotion, but more or less on anything you might want to work on.
I mean, I agree 100%. If you look, this is a big questions podcast, and really I come from a philosophy background. But as I looked at, for me, this is kind of the pursuit of truth without ever catching it. That's the idea of Chasing Leviathan. And like, I didn't want to just make it a philosophy podcast because exactly what you're talking about. Like, if you're going to find real answers and real explanations, you're going to have to diverge into other fields. So, I mean, this is near and dear to my heart. Go ahead.
Sorry, now I was just thinking that if you think of it, historically, disciplines have diverged and specialized relatively recently. So if you take philosophy and psychology, they were the same thing up to the 19th century. And the same you can say of what was called natural philosophy and later on became science. So, yeah, I mean, it's nothing new, right?
Right. It's a return in some ways, yes. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's interesting even to see like the beginning of terms like science, right? In like you see it growing out of course, this is Heidegger's analysis, but growing out of Aristotle. Like philosophy has birthed a lot of these, and so in some ways, there's a unity. That's actually a question I have here for you, but there's a unity to how everything works together. And so we can't study all of it at once, but so we have to break it down, but you have to at times like cross these boundaries in order to understand something.
Well, you mentioned Aristotle, and he had, sorry, I interrupt you all the time, but I'm Italian and I talk.
This is how my family's New England. We interrupt each other all the time. This is great. I'm used to it. So
okay. I was thinking, because you mentioned Aristotle, he has something very interesting to say on this point on emotion in his treatise on psychology. It's called On the Soul in English, the Anima. He talks about the way emotions are defined by the dialectic philosopher and the natural philosopher. And he says, for example, with anger, the dialectic philosopher says that anger is a desire for revenge, whereas the natural philosopher defines anger in terms of the kind of physiological arousal it brings about, so boiling of the heart of the blood around the heart. And then he says, well, these two definitions are not enough taken in isolation. You have to bring them together. And it's not enough to add one to the other. You really have to integrate them. And he was right. And that's what scientists and scholars in philosophy of emotion and emotion theory more in general are trying to do these days, I think.
Yes. And there's that kind of, I've had several philosophers on to talk about the nature of explanations in science, and it becomes very clear that you need multiple types of explanations to create a more cohesive picture, a more comprehensive picture, right? Like if someone, if I'm walking with my wife, I think this is the example that we used in that other podcast. If I'm walking with my wife and a tree twirls down, or not a tree, I'm sorry, a leaf twirls down from a tree in the wind, right? And I have an opportunity to say something poetic there, something romantic. Or, if I'm like, well, if you look at the wind and you look at like all the structure of the veins of the leaves, it's like, that's a missed opportunity, right? That's not the point of that explanation. And so the realizing that every explanation has a purpose, I think, just to kind of hopefully complement what you're saying from Aristotle, and also to make sure I'm on the same track with you. Does that make? Am I following what you're saying with Aristotle? Would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. So if you want, the idea is that if you want to really to reach a proper understanding of what emotions are about, then you need to structure your inquiry at different levels. And then you need to find a way to put everything together.
Yes.
To the extent it is possible. So you have to find a way to build up a unitary explanation that takes into account the different discoveries you've made at the different levels of inquiry.
Yes.
That also means taking into account all kinds of materials. So, for example, the historical humanities can be very important as ways to gather data. The same way, so to say, the psychologists collect data using self-reports. For example, the scholars in historical humanities can do the same job looking into literature, art, and they can find a lot of information about the way people of different cultures or in different time talked about the way they experienced emotions. And that's those are data we should take into account.
Yes. I mean, even in here, just as an example, the value of that historical research is that you have distance in both location and time, right? Because if you just take like a psychologist just does a study from people all in the same culture, their emotions are formed by that culture. And so by doing that historical research, you get access to emotions in many ways, you're researching from the dead, so to speak.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, of course, you can do cross-cultural research now as well,
Yes.
so synchronically, so to say. But that's a very interesting thing to do, because one of the main issues I think that are still open, one of the main challenges that are still open in emotion theory, is that, well, we still have to find a way that to accommodate variability, cultural variability, social variability, linguistic variability within a natural framework.
Yes.
So typically, the main theories that are available either deal with nature, the nature side of the emotional experience, or they try to reduce nature to a minimum. Everybody's trying to get past beyond this polarization, but it's not as easy as you would think, and so that's a real challenge. And I think that's where historical humanities and cross-cultural studies can help us a lot.
Yes. Yeah. So many directions that makes me want to go, but for our listeners, we're about 15 minutes in. I'm not expecting a complete definition because I think that is very unfair in an hour. But what's a good starting point to talk about emotions? Like when we talk about emotions, what's a good starting definition that you give so that at least to start our inquiry, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, that's a problem in itself, and it's the problem I deal with in the introduction. So, do we really need? So, how specific a definition do we need? Do we really expect there to be one definition? So that seems to be the assumption very often, but I disagree with that assumption. I don't think it's a good idea, or at least I don't think it's a good idea to start with an assumption like that of an essentialist kind. So the idea that we can find what really makes an emotion the thing that it is in a Platonic sense, right? So that we can get at the essence of the definition. I don't think we can do that. I don't think we should do that. And of course, this is an object of debate in contemporary theory. Scholars have made distinctions that are really useful. There is one very famous psychologist who's been working on emotion a lot, James Russell, and he has made a distinction between the scientific project, a scientific study of emotion, a prescriptive study, and a descriptive study. And as for the descriptive side of the project, he has he has argued that we should adopt a prototype theory of definitions. So we should look at best examples, but also be aware that there are not so good examples, that there are borderline cases, and I think is on the right track. So the concept of emotion, at least in folk psychology, is nothing that you can define by identifying a set of necessary and sufficient properties. You might want to do that in a lab if you are, I don't know, a neuroscientist and you need to do something specific. But if you're interested in the way people talk about their own affective experiences, then I think you have to give up a classical approach to definitions, so the essentialist approach to definitions.
Yeah, and that's very fair. Like, even as I was just kind of meditating on this myself, the variety of what I call emotions, it feels like it's a big umbrella, and part of the work is breaking down and trying to figure out like all the different things that are happening. Like it seems like there's just a wealth of data even within myself when I sit and think about things like, there's anger when something gets spilled, right? And there's and which is just like this quick flash, and I'm over it in like a second, right? I'm just like, oh, that's annoying, right? And then there's like these deep and abiding choices, like, you talk, I think you mentioned something about how values and emotions are connected, that like, this kind of this feeling that lasts and just kind of at a base level for a long time, and that's so different. And it's weird that it's covered by the same word. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but I don't think it's weird it's covered by the same word. That's just the way it is with many different things. So the prototype, the best example of an emotion often goes, which is my way to answer your previous question.
Yeah.
What kind of working definition we might start with. So the prototype of an emotion is an episodic experience. So it doesn't extend over days. It's normally something that we perceive as episodic. It goes with feelings, so it feels like something, right? It is elicited by some salient stimulus. It can be external stimulus in the environment or some idea or imagining that you have, that you appraise in a certain way. So you do. I don't like saying that emotions are evaluations or entail the expression or the formulation of a value judgment, but I could say that they are ways of experiencing values without meaning that values are already there, as if they were objective properties, but in the emotional experience, some kind of value comes up. For the emoter. So the prototype is like this, but it does by no means all instances of what we call emotions are like that. So you've made the example of anger. When you're prototypically angry, you feel, I don't know, blood coming up to your face, heart racing, your body posture becomes aggressive, and you have a desire to remove an obstacle, or to take a revenge. But then it might also happen that you are in a hurry after this podcast and you meet a friend, but you really have to be home very soon. And so your friend would like to stop and talk to you, but you say, I fear I can't stop right now. Well, that doesn't mean, you're experiencing all the symptoms of the prototypical emotion, right? It's just, but you still use that word. And we have to account for that. So that's not the best example, but it is an example. It's a way ordinary speakers of English talk. And if we have a descriptive project, so if we want to explain or to understand how English speakers in their daily life talk about emotion and what they think emotions are, then we have to take into account both the prototype and the borderline case, the less good example.
An interesting thing about what you just said is how how do you evaluate, and I don't know that you can, what are your thoughts about people saying they have an emotion because they know they're supposed to, but they don't? So for instance, I'm going to use the example I run to on a daily basis. I have a bunch of kids running around the house. I homeschool, and I tell them they need to say sorry. And they say sorry and very clearly do not feel sorry, if that makes sense. Like, they're supposed to feel remorse, and and they are communicating that they're feeling remorse, and yet, and maybe some of this is the. I'm curious what your thoughts are on these kind of mixed signals that maybe imply false emotion, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, well, you tell them that they should say sorry or that they should be sorry.
Well, I tell them that they should say sorry, with the implication that they should feel remorse for hitting their brother in the head with a truck, or whatever whatever they have done. Right.
Okay. Well, you're just trying to teach them some social rules, I guess, and in general, moral behavior, so to say, there are ways, which I think are the right ways to explain it in terms of affective dispositions. So again, that's what Aristotle would do, right? So he would his idea of virtues and vices were dispositions towards the emotions. So virtues are the correct ways to experience emotions, to have the right emotion in the right context and to the right extent, to the right degree of intensity.
So we would be training emotions.
Well, yeah, practicing actions in such a way that they embody a certain way of feeling about things. I think that's more or less what he meant in modernized terms. And so that's what I think you're trying to teach your kids. The appropriate way of feeling about what you've just done is regret or guilt, but I mean, guilt.
Guilt's a psychologically laden term. Yeah. But
it's not very pleasant to teach guilt to anybody. But yeah, regret. You shouldn't, so you're teaching them how to look, what you think is the correct effective way to look at the situation. So what are the salient features of the situations and the situation and the way they should emote about them. So that's a way of building up moral characters via emotions.
So before we go too far, I want to make sure we get a little bit into the book. Kind of that first section, the emotions of others. Can you talk a little bit? You base the first debate is about the emotions of others, and you connect that kind of with this first section on biology or culture and the work of Charles Darwin. Can you talk to me a little bit about how Charles Darwin's work connects to the emotions of others?
Yeah, that's right. So I divided the book into three main parts: expression, feeling, and action. And these happen to correspond to the to the main dimensions of the emotional experience. So a prototypical emotion would be expressed somehow, like it has bodily manifestations, so to say. These bodily manifestations don't need to have a communicative function, but they usually do. So, but your face changes expression, right? Your body posture changes, and so on. Feeling is about the way you feel. the what it feels like of the situation, of the experience, and action is what you do. So the way you might decide to act. And my main point in the book is that these are not dimensions of the emotion. So they're not components of a thing that is the emotion, but they are different ways to look at emotion itself. So emotion is all these things. And the three guys with whom I start each section, so Darwin for expression, William James for feeling, and John Dewey for action, I think that interpreted in a charitable way, they were trying just to say that. So emotions are units of experience. They are ways of experiencing the world that express themselves in all these different ways. So they have a feeling, they go with that, they are action tendencies, or they prioritize some course of action over another, and they go with bodily manifestation. So the first section is about that, is about expression, both in the sense of what it shows and in the way what it shows on the body is also a way of the body to get ready to act in a certain way. So think, for example, of activation of the autonomous nervous system, and you might have involuntary changes, right, that show, and at the same time they are meant, or at least that was Darwin explanation, they are meant to prepare the organism to act in a certain way, to flee or to attack, for example. And so in that framework, I then go on to explain, to review the main contemporary theories about facial expressions. So there's basic emotion theory, and then I explain the opposite theories. They're the critics, and so constructionism, those who bring a lot of attention on variability rather than universality. And in the end, I thought it was a good way to tackle the same problem, universality versus variability, that of looking into the way into the explanations that are very different from each other we have for how we are so good at understanding how another person feels. And of course, that at least prima facie, it starts by looking at somebody else's face. So expressions and manifestations of emotion are very important. You don't need to be looking at them, really. You can listen to a story about them. That it's more than enough. But it's about how emotions manifest and are expressed. So that's why I decided to discuss that debate in social cognition at that stage of the book.
I don't know if are you familiar with Wittgenstein's work? He has
A little bit.
So he has a series of lectures on emotion, and he actually talks quite a bit about faces. So I don't know if you've read those lectures. They're really
Yeah. Yeah. He
But
supports the idea. Oh, sorry.
no, I was going to say, even as you're talking though, I love the way that you're talking about defining emotions as like these disparate parts that we describe as one process, but there's not like an emotion thing, right? They're like, if I'm understanding you correctly, so I'm just making sure I'm on the same track. Wittgenstein talks very similarly about thinking, right? One of the problems with thinking is people look for like kind of these essentialist definitions where it's like, where's the thinking thing? You know, like where's the, kind of this Platonic ideal. And he starts talking about how literally what we're doing is like, if I'm writing, that's thinking, right? Like the thinking is as much while it's happening in my head, it's also happening in my hand and on the paper and with my hand moving the pen, right? And it's the entirety of the process that we are describing and using as part of we are using for our like language toolbox, as he would say. Is that similar to how you think about emotions? Am I on the right track there? That it's this, that we're describing multiple things going together as a value, like that's a valuable thing for us to incorporate into a single process?
Yeah, I think so. And it's also a good idea to look at emotions as to thinking and at any other cognitive process as a distributed event. So it doesn't happen somewhere. Like we normally say that emotions are inside us, or that we are inside an emotion.
Yes.
So that's conceptual for theory. I discussed that a little bit in the introduction. But those are exactly, so they're precisely metaphors. That's not what really happens, right? So there's nothing inside us and only inside us. And looking at expression and behavior and action and feeling at the same time is meant to bring out the idea that emotions are all over the place. So they're not, you can't localize them somewhere. They are modes of behavior at the same time as subjective experiences and ways of finding value in what's going on. So yeah, Wittgenstein is very relevant. And he's relevant as well for, as you mentioned, for matters of definition, because obviously the idea of family resemblance is
Yes.
Wittgenstein's idea, right? So in the philosophical investigations, it discusses the concept of game as an example, and that really works well to explain what a prototype is and how categories, well, not so much what the prototype is, but how categories should be interpreted in a flexible way as capable of including new members. That what is really important is that there is some relevant similarity between any two of these members to allow them to be part of the category.
Yes. That whole concept of family resemblance for definition really helped solve numerous philosophical problems that I had in my head. So, and I think this is a great example of that we use emotion to cover a variety of processes, and it's useful for us to talk about them all together. But I mean, we can talk about our body reacting in an angry way, and yet our consciousness is clear, right? Like, you can have all these, the feeling might be even different from the physical reaction, right? Like, so for instance, there are certain physical stimuli that will be like anger, right? Like, and so whereas you don't have the feeling of anger. An example would be when people go to lift, they have other people slap them so that their body reacts with the fight or flight response, but they're not angry at the other person. Like they want to be, so it's so that they can lift the weights better. Which I was like, I think I would just do 10 pounds less. I don't need someone to smack me. But so yeah, that's very helpful for me. And I think you're providing just great categories to think about this, kind of like this bodily manifestation, this somatic, this feeling, this action. As we move kind of in that second section, we talk about emotions and values. Sense, and your debate is about sense and sensibility and decision making. I think this is so important. Like when I think about it touches on all areas of life, because decision making touches on all areas of life, and it's very clear that human beings are not are not fully reason based in their decision making. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that debate looks like? And I think you tie that to William James. And so can you tell us how those things connect?
Right. Yeah, sure. So that's the section on the subjective experience, which is why I started with William James, who was interpreted to say that emotion consists in the perception of bodily feelings. So if you only read his most famous paper on emotion, which is What is an Emotion, which was published in 1884, that might be the idea you get, that he's saying, he writes it in capital letters. He seems to be putting a lot of emphasis on that definition. Emotion is the perception of bodily changes. And by doing that, he seems to be reducing what an emotion is to one of its dimension, that is the way it feels to experience certain bodily changes, which is normally, he introduces it at the opposite way as the one that is widespread in common sense. So in common sense, we think something happens, we perceive it, we express an opinion, a value-based opinion about it. We have an emotion, and then we have physical symptoms that are a result of the emotion itself, right? So we normally talk of physical symptoms in terms of consequences, what the emotion does to us, what the emotion does. So James says, well, no, that order of the sequence is wrong. It goes the other way. You first have the bodily changes, and then you perceive them, and the moment you perceive them, you experience the emotion. So if you go through everything he wrote, which is not a walk in the park, because he wrote really a lot of stuff, and he's
Yes,
changing his mind so often. Even so, I discovered that it was so much, I don't know if you can say that in English, but I don't know the word to say somebody who changes his mind very often, but he was insecure in some way, right? He couldn't make up his mind. And the point that he changed the name of one of his own songs 3 times. So the final name was given to his boy when he was already 7. So just to give you an example of how he can change opinion in philosophical matters as well. But anyway, if you go past all that, then I think it becomes visible that James also puts a lot of emphasis on, not emphasis, but importance at least, on the evaluative side of the experience. So he acknowledges, of course, that the emotion is elicited within a context, in a situation where we experience, we perceive a stimulus to which we attribute a certain value, and we attribute this value not only based on the stimulus itself, but on the context within which we encounter the stimulus. So 10 years later, 10 years after the first paper, he writes another paper where he explains his views because he's being criticized. And so what I do in the second part of the book is to take up the criticism. And so I just oppose so-called feeling theories of emotion. So the mainstream interpretation of James, even though I don't think it's correct, with the criticism that has been addressed to him. And so the idea that emotions and values are either the same thing or really close to each other, that emotions entails either the perception of value or the formulation of some kind of judgment on values, and so on and so forth. And that led me quite naturally to set up a debate on indecision making. So the way human beings make choices, and of course, there's a lot of classical research there, Kahneman and Tversky, especially the psychophysics of value. So they have shown very nicely that we're not as rational as we think we are. We make choices based on our particular position and our particular situation. So the traditional theory in economics was not really working. It was not realistic. And then, of course, there's Damasio and his hypothesis. The take-home message is that there's no way, because there's no distinction between rationality and affectivity. So the distinction is something that we make. It's artificial. It's a way of producing definitions, but that's not how it really works. And because there is not a distinction of this kind, it just never happens that we make choices either in a cool head or because we've been following our heart. We always do both. And sometimes that's for the good. Sometimes it's for the bad, for the ill. I don't remember how you say that in English.
Yeah.
But it just happens, right? It's inevitable.
Yes. A good example of this, and I saw research on it after it happened to me. When we first started our business, we had no money, very common, right? So my wife and I started a business together, and I knew the right financial decisions to make, and I often didn't make them because I was stressed. And then they've shown research that people who are poor often make worse financial decisions, then even if they change economically, they will actually also start making better financial decisions after they have less stress, right? And so it's this perpetuating cycle that like stress will talking about, you said their position determines how they do things, that even they will know they're not good decisions, but they're so stressed that they will respond what we would consider less rationally, right? So as you were talking about like how the classical economic theory, it's like, well, everyone will just do what's best for them. And it's like when you put people under stress, like it becomes more emotional. And that's just common sense. But when you talk about these higher theories, you're talking about armchair thinking. We've mentioned that before. It's really just one of those things that like it's easy to miss. It's easy to be like, well, of course people do what's best for them. It's like, stop and just think about your life for a second and think about the people around you. Do they always do what's best for them? Do you always do what's best for you?
Yeah. But the thing is that also determining so sometimes it's easy to see what's best for somebody. But I
Yes.
think one of the very interesting issues here is how our own perception of values might depend on our situation, and not only, which is easy to see, our social situation or our cultural situation, but sometimes also simply our bodily states. So the same kind of stimulus, we can evaluate it very differently if we have slept well, if we have had a nice dinner last night, and if nothing really is bothering us at the moment. Or we interpret it in a very different way if we didn't get any sleep because one of the kids has been crying all night. I don't know if any of your kids is very small, or because we've had to work until late, we've had too much coffee, I don't know, we have our period, whatever. That puts us in a bodily condition that, inclines us to, for example, to get angry more easily than we would in a different situation. And so the same stimulus for the same subject in different moments of his or her life can take up a different value. And that, of course, happens when we make choices as well.
And you've referenced this already. It's astonishing to me how universal this experience is. Like when you talk about lack of sleep makes you more irritable, I'm guarantee you every single person listening to this is like, yeah. I know exactly what that feels like, right? But on the other hand, there's so much distance too. And I think, you're talking about the unity and disunity debate, where it's like my experience of my emotions is so hard to communicate to other people, right? These are it's there's the basics that get communicated, but communicating it effectively and and I'm thinking in some ways here of Derrida talking about just the distance in interpretation. Like you talk about that makes me angry, and the way that like one person perceives anger in themselves and what that means for them is often very different for someone else.
Yeah, no, I see your point. I think that's true, but I think that prototype theory can help there as well.
Yeah.
So, or family resemblance, even better. So, what is necessary? Because it's true that the variability is really great
Yes. Yeah.
within. Well, the best way to put it, I think, would be that cultural variability is incredibly great and can take infinite ways within the boundaries set by the way our body is built. So human bodies are the same and have been the same for some time. So if we study any historical document, we can assume that those who are talking to us from there more or less, looked like us. And so their body functioned like us. They saw in the same way, they heard the same way, and so on. So that would work as a premise. But so in this context, it is true that we see variability all the time. We see differences all the time, different ways to talk about emotions and different way to express them, different way to act out of an emotion. And not only if you compare different cultures, but also among individuals of the same, that belong to the same group. Still, I think all of us would more or less agree that at least when it comes to very basic reactions, we always have an idea of what's going on. It's not that difficult to see whether somebody's right.
And if someone can't do that, then we assume a deficiency on their part. So like, I think we've all been in situations where like someone's obviously angry and someone's obviously missing it. And we're like, what? How do you not notice they're angry? Right? Sorry, just to go long. Yeah.
That is also true of narratives. So there are languages that have words that we don't have. So the classical example here is the German word Schadenfreude, right? I don't think the English have a word like that. The Italians do not. So that's a word that names the emotion you experience when somebody fails to do what they would like to do, and you feel happy about that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we don't have a word to say that. But if a German speaker tells me the story, so gives me the structure, the script of the experience, then I can say, oh, well, that's exactly how I felt when I was a kid and my sister was punished, for example, because my parents did something wrong, right? So I have the experience and I understand it because you've given me a story. So these stories can also be very different because, as you said, and that's absolutely right, anger can be elicited by different conditions for different people. So what makes you angry is different from what makes me angry, and the same goes with fear and with everything else. But you don't need everything to be exactly the same. So you can't, if you're not an essentialist, you don't need to say, well, the components of an emotion are eliciting conditions to which you attribute value, physiological arousal, feelings, so subjective experience and action. So these are the components, but they don't need to be there all the time in the same way for all instances of emotion.
And that's going back to, sorry, go ahead. That's going back to the family resemblance.
Right, between the elements of the story. Those are more than enough to understand each other. And that's also true in biology. So, for example, consider the behavior that is produced by affective states. Take fear. So fear, you couldn't say that all instances of fear in a natural framework go with the behavior of fleeing, because sometimes you freeze, sometimes you fight, and rats do that. And they do that depending on the kind of stimulus they encounter and the way the stimulus is presented to them. So variability is there in nature already. And it's enough that there are some cluster of properties that occur in different scripts for us to understand the similarity and to understand that what's going on, we know what it is and we have a name for that, or at least we know how it feels like.
Yes, and that's why you keep coming back to, and I appreciate this, the prototyping and just that idea of family resemblance, right? Like that idea that we don't have, like, we can group all these things together and talk about them in a meaningful and effective way without having to have these hard and set, boxes for everything to fit in. Forgive me, I have to share, like, you were talking about the cultural variability. I saw a clip of an Indian mom talking about how she moved to America and she was surprised by everyone saying, "I love you." And she said, "I've never said I love you to my kids." And like the crowd like gasped, right? They're like, "How could you not say?" And she's like, "I don't say I love you. That's weird." She's like, "But I wake up in the morning at 5 and I make a cup of chai for my kids every morning. I wake them up for school. I pack their lunches. Like, that's how I say I love you. That's way more effective." And that's that cultural variability. Like, to me, that's like I can't imagine, right? But it's that's that cultural variability we're discussing.
Yeah, that's right. So you don't need a word, first of all, or you don't need to say a word in order to experience the emotion. You wouldn't say "I love you" to a kid in Italian either. I mean, it would sound very dramatic. It would put the kid You could do it. It wouldn't sound too weird, but it's not common, and I don't think. But we have another way to say that. So to say that we love our friends and our children. When you use the word love, it's typically either it is something like we want to be really important, it's a very sacred moment, or it's about romantic love. Otherwise, we would say the equivalent of I want you well, it's ti voglio bene, and so I care for you, right? And that's what you normally say to kids. But obviously, it's the same emotion that you feel for your kids. Italian parents feel for theirs, I'm sure.
Right. It's not like there's whole countries where like parents don't love their kids, right? Or don't like their kids or care for their kids. Yes. So I think that's really that's a good example of like the variability of even the factors involved, right? The actions that follow. And yeah, that's its own rabbit hole. But I do want to being respectful of your time. That third section. So for me, my own background, philosophy of art, as we talk about, bring this up here, the John Dewey's work, and I wonder, are you referencing art as experience here? When you talk about the debate side of it, being the emotions towards fictional characters. I'm really curious. Oh, go ahead.
No, right. So Dewey is there just because he puts a lot of emphasis on action. And so I use him as I use him. A lot of contemporary philosophy as well refers to Dewey when it comes to talking of emotion in terms of behavior. So that's why he's there. But no, I don't use his art as experience when I discuss the paradox of fiction. That's just a contemporary debate, relatively recent, that also entails another debate that on the analogy between perception and imagination, or it doesn't entail it necessarily, but I put the two together.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the paradox of fiction, the debate on the paradox of fiction started officially in 1975 when this guy, Colin Redford, said that he thought so he noticed that there are similarities, important similarities to the sadness we feel when we lose somebody in real life and the sadness we feel when our favorite character on the theater stage is killed. So we might even cry, so the expression of the emotion is similar. The way it feels is similar, but there are some important differences, mainly behavioral disanalogies. And but even more importantly, to the mind of Redford, the difference is that in one case, in real life, we have a belief about the existence of what we are sad about. So if a person, we've lost a real person, we assume it is true that happened, that the loss is there. And if we learned that it was a false alarm, it was a false news, then we wouldn't be sad anymore. But that's not the case in the theater or where we read a book, because we know from the beginning that nothing exists, and still, we have an emotion, a strong emotional experience. So he says, how is that possible? And that's how the debate started. But in fact, it was the same issue that Socrates raises in Plato's Ion, with Ion. And so he asks, Ion is a rhapsode, he recites Homer, and he does it. Of course, he has to do it very well because the audience will pay him if he is good. So he wants to move them. Therefore, when he recites something sad or pitiful, he also shows sadness and pity. And to an extent, he probably feels it too. And so Socrates asks him, are you mad? Don't you know that's all non-existent? So that is actually the real historical beginning of the debate. And that's, again, where the historical humanities might help you to enrich the debate. But that's what that debate in the book is about. So there's not so much Dewey, unfortunately, but in the next book, we'll take this suggestion, this input you gave into account.
Oh, no worries. I was just curious. I did not get to that part. The Yeah, and that's such a fascinating thing. Obviously, I start thinking of Aristotle's ideas of catharsis and like what are the values of like purging emotions. Maybe dealing, not being able to handle certain emotions with real life things, so using fictional things, but it doesn't seem to be restricted to that, right? Like, and so uh, it's a really I I think what you said at the beginning, how you're talking about how perception and imagination don't necessarily entail each other, and how all of that is debatable, is that when I'm walking through this issue, it seems like every single aspect is debatable. I mean, that's probably just philosophy in general, but this, you talk about what is the status of fiction? What are the status of fictional emotions? Well, like I can't answer that till I even know what fiction is, right? And so it it's really fascinating to me. Um, how do you? What are some practical applications that you feel you can take away from uh, these emotions we have? What are some things that you yourself have learned as you're facing these uh, emotions towards fictional characters, or how you deal with other people having emotions towards fictional characters?
Mm, well, I'm not sure. I've never thought about it in these terms, if there are practical applications. I think, well, there might be in terms of, for example, um, something that is usually thought is that experiencing fiction, good fiction or good art, and the affective experience that goes with it might help refine your moral sensitivity. So surely there's a debate about that, which I don't touch, and I must say I don't really know much about it, but it's interesting. So that could be a practical output of a debate like this. But otherwise, it's just feeling emotions for people who do not exist is something that happens to us on a daily basis when we watch the TV. Or so I think that's practical enough, to be
Yes.
able to understand what's going on when that happens.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about philosophy in general is that kind of like what's the practical side of it? It's like the the opening up of what seems ordinary into something extraordinary. Like it is strange to feel sadness for the death of someone who's not real, right? And so I think that's a great answer. Kind of as we wrap up here, what's one takeaway you would leave for our audience?
Oh God, I don't know. You must notice that I don't have many answers, so that's a very philosophical attitude on my part. So even in the book,
Yeah,
my preferences, I think, are visible, but quietly so, and I don't really give any answer. So the main thing is probably interdisciplinarity, transpassing, looking at what people have to say in other fields, trying to build full perspective as rich as possible. That I think is a necessity. Um, um, yeah, that's probably the main thing I would recommend as an
yeah,
attitude in general. Yeah.
and I think that just really is a great way to tie all this up. That we go all the way back to that question about interdisciplinary. That the idea is to make uh, this field as rich as possible, while also understanding that it is messy and that what the goal is to build a very rich prototype. Right? It's not to cut off the boundaries of emotion, and especially like when you think about something like emotion, cutting off doesn't sound like the right way to handle it, anyways. Right? And so to have that kind of interdisciplinary, open field in building something comprehensive, I think is great. Um, Dr. Campeggiani, wonderful to have you on today. Thank you.
I felt the same. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.